Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second half of Cyber 1.3. Our third distinguished panel moves to the issue of how friends and allies can work together in a range of cyber operations. Our moderator is Mr. Bill Parker, Special International Advisor for International Affairs, Space Foundation. Bill, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to the panel where the rubber meets the road. These people are responsible for extreme missions and getting things done. We're in the unenviable position of having to start immediately after lunch. So we're going to say some outrageous things periodically to ensure that you're awake and possibly listening to us. Just briefly, I come to this with no special expertise other than the fact that I served in the Foreign Service for about 31 years. And during those years, we didn't even know what cyber was during the Cold War. My last overseas assignment was at U.S. Strategic Command in Omaha, where I got a heavy dose of it for 3 years, and I know just a touch bit more than I know now. I tossed around how I was going to begin this panel. I think what I'll do is introduce these illustrious people immediately because we have a lot to get through, and none of these panels ever follow the tangent that you've set for them. To my far left is a friend and a good colleague, Colonel Jörg Dronia. He is the branch chief for strategic planning for air, space, and cyber in the German Air Force. He has done this for many years and has had a stellar career in the German Air Force. And like most air forces, he has segued into that segment or that component, airspace and cyber. Welcome, sir. To his right and my immediate left is Colonel Thomas French, U.S. Air Force, the Deputy Director of Space Protection Programs at the Air Force Space Command. We'll go into more detail on that. You have to understand they have 3 or 4 pages of biography here, and we want to keep moving. To my immediate right is an old friend, and I don't have your bio in here, Frosty. My wife hit it. Group Captain Adrian Frost, call sign Frosty. We've known each other for quite some time. He works inside the Beltway and is currently the Defense Authority for Cyber in the U.S. from the UK and is assigned to U.S. Cybercom. I think I've even known you when you were doing tornadoes, right? That's correct. Yeah. We're going back. The youngest and the smartest of the bunch, in most cases, to my far right, Dr. Major Kevin Kuciapinski, Applied Engineering, Colorado Site Engineering and Research Facility, Aerospace Data Facility for the National Reconnaissance Office. And he has been of great help to me pulling the themes together for this panel. In addition, I have to thank someone close to him, MK, for helping me pull some of these themes together, and she's here, and also my wife for putting up with me for my lack of computer knowledge and assuming the responsibility of getting some of these things out to people. As a political scientist, diplomat for 31 years, we in the world, and especially in America, were kind of dependent on the way nation states engaged each other, and there were kind of rules of the road and expected conduct. And even before that, for almost 2 centuries, since the Congress of Vienna, there was kind of a gradual codification of the rules of the game for guiding interstate relations. Even between unfriendly countries, countries that went to war, there were some red lines, some lines you didn't cross. And to sum it up, there was kind of a basic premise that's been the formula for this for years. Don't do to me what you don't want me to do to you has been the way we've summed it up for many, many years. It's just that simple. However, we move into the period that is new to most of us, and that's the technological era. And that means those rules have been dangerously undermined The international system is now at risk because those rules don't apply very much anymore, or we don't adhere to them anymore. We have highly sophisticated capabilities for inflicting violence by remote targets, as well as cross-border state-sponsored terrorism. They're undermining the clear demarcation of what is permissible and what is not permissible. We have completely turned on its head all the things that I practiced with and engaged with as a diplomat for 31 years. The game has drastically changed. Scientific advances have now increased the potential scope of acts whose perpetrators may not be easily identified and which may not be intercepted in a timely manner. We don't know who they are, we don't know when they're coming, we don't know where they're going to hit us. These gentlemen have a Herculean task of trying to get their arms around any one of those sectors. Nevertheless, we're afraid of science. We're afraid of nuclear weapons. I spent 31 years in the diplomacy corps fighting the Cold War, and we didn't attack each other. We did something right. As soon as we moved into this era, we're getting 1 million attacks a day. What are we doing with them? Is it the fault of the technology? I don't think so. We marched down the nuclear path, and there's so many great uses for nuclear technology that we can't even count them on one hand. It was George Bernard Shaw who said, "Science never solved a problem without creating 10 more." We have 10 more, and the internet is very useful. We have national leaders even in our country. The debate rages right now. We can use long-distance air drones for lethal strikes across national borders against targeted individuals, and we're still not quite sure of the ROE, or the rules of engagement, and it's happening every day. The dissemination of computer viruses can disrupt the military-industrial assets of rivals by just pushing the enter button. And these gentlemen are in charge of trying to nip that in the bud or take advantage of it. All of that to say, we're going to discuss some of those aspects of this modern phenomena, how we get our arms around this if we can, what kind of codes are involved in this new conduct, and look for your interaction to make sure you're not asleep and to make sure we're on our game. What I was going to do first is ask Colonel Dronia to kind of set the tone. He's brought some prepared remarks, and it gives us some insight into what our allies across the pond are doing in this area. Colonel Dronia, you may come here, or you may thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, and good afternoon. And it's really a pleasure, not only a pleasure, but also an honor to be here as a first non-US speaker on this topic today. I really appreciate that. So thank you very much for the kind invitation and the opportunity to discuss some aspects of the German perspective on joint cyber operations with friends and allies. And as a non-native speaker, please allow me that I stick, especially for this statement, a little bit further and more strictly to the statement which has been prepared by me for today's occasion. I'm representing presently the Strategic Planning Directorate of the German Ministry of Defense. This directorate has been established as part of a substantial reorganization of the German Armed Forces and the MOD almost exactly 1 year ago. The branch I am heading deals with future developments in 3 of the 5 global commons: air, space, and cyberspace. The latter one we conceive as part of the information environment, something that is all-encompassing. Here all action and information is gathered and interpreted by human beings, so we don't limit ourselves on IT when talking on cyberspace. Our scope of work or responsibility may be described as to envision possible future developments in air, space, and cyberspace, and to conceptualize what we consider might become tasks for the German Armed Forces based on course on political guidance. From these anticipated tasks, we want to derive and to evolve the needed abilities and capabilities for the German Armed Forces to counter the future. These abilities and capabilities cover the fields of doctrine, organization, training, material, personnel, and so forth. Therefore, we think through the wide area of cyber operations as well, and how these might influence the military environment, and in the context of this panel, military operations in the future. Cyber operations, in our understanding, consists of two sides: the cyber defense and offensive cyber operations, or the latter one in a more popular term, cyber network operations. Despite the fact that cyber defense with emphasis on the technical aspects seems to be on a good way and international cooperation seemingly moves ahead, the denial of attacks and the safe operation of computer networks remains a huge challenge. It is not to be underestimated, and we should not back off with our efforts to guarantee mission accomplishment. Despite that, when it comes to operations, both sides have to cooperate and have to be synchronized somehow in order to support and enable the operation, avoid getting in each other's way, and achieve the given objectives. This would already be quite an effort nationally. In multinational operations with friends, allies, and partners, and this is the normality nowadays, this proves to be more than a challenge. In German cyber network operations, we only be employed for the purpose of self-defense or on the basis of a military mandate approved by the German parliament. German military capabilities will in principle be provided under the roof of multinational operations and will normally not undertake military actions on its own. This applies for activities in the cyberspace too. This multinationality of missions requires the coordination, synchronization, and deconfliction of cyber operations by all contributors and participants. Let me give you an example. One partner nation might be planning to shut down a web server of the adversary. Another partner nation might just be using this web server for information exploitation. Or generally speaking, how will it be prevented that partner nation A is performing a cyber attack on a target that is being used for cyber espionage by partner nation B? If they don't know about each other's activities, this could lead to unintended effects hampering the whole operation. When talking multinational, we firstly mean NATO. During an international conference at the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in June last year, it was discussed that NATO does not envisage own offensive cyber capabilities. But, like with other military capabilities, NATO, as an alliance of states that can contribute with different military capabilities to an operation, could call upon cyber capabilities of its members within the framework of a mission. In this case, of course, NATO could and would coordinate the capabilities of different members and is willing to take the important deconfliction function. Well-known coordination and synchronization procedures we already use in reconnaissance and targeting, for example, could lead the way in cyber operations as well. Reach-back possibilities or necessities due to the strategic impact that cyber operations might have could slow down in theater coordination and may require political guidance. Another aspect here is, of course, the conduct of electronic warfare operations, which contribute to intelligence operations as well as to kinetic and non-kinetic effects in an operation and could serve as another threat to follow. So in conclusion, we clearly see the need for a lot of conceptual work in this area in order to advance the aforementioned coordination of cyber operations. However, due to the involvement of non-military players and the sensitivity of this issue, the devil is like more or less everywhere in the details. Maybe we should start with this on a bilateral base first to get a grip on the challenge, and I see the established cooperation in these fields between the United States and Germany a key for success and continuation with other partners. The prerequisite is to achieve in the first instance a common understanding of joint and combined operations to achieve the most out of these relatively new capabilities while comprehensively defending against dangers arising from the global connectedness. Finally, I would like to express that not long ago we could have talked about the cyber issue in a very generic and general way, and would have reassured ourselves that this is a very fashionable and important topic to talk about in more detail. Today, thanks to such events like this Cyber Symposium, this topic is something that is taken for granted to be important, and we now have advanced to be able to dive into the subject in more detail. Thank you very much for the patience in listening to me, and I'm happy to receive any questions.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Frosty, I'm going to lead off with you briefly to follow in. I lied. You've been involved with cyber for 10, 15 years or so. You've worked with a number of coalition partners, allied partners. You've put together the UK cybersecurity strategy. Could you elaborate on a little bit of the collaboration you see, where we are now, how we've evolved to a certain level, and where we need to go?
Yeah, no problem at all, Bill. It's quite an interesting one when we look at how do we take forward this collaboration and how do we enable ourselves to operate jointly, because, of course, as the importance of, or the recognition of cyber as a domain has emerged in, various countries over the last few years, and, US Cyber Command at the moment starting to build out forces. One of our seniors back in the UK recently said, but isn't cyber old wine in new bottles? And that's quite an interesting thought, because I wrestled with this issue as I was trying to explain and persuade my seniors right to the way to the top of the shop why we needed to focus in on cyber in the SDSR. We ended up putting $1 billion into it in the end. I like to say $1 billion. It's actually £650 million, but $1 billion sounds better. At the end of the day, there is a degree to which that comment about old wine in new bottles is sort of fair. But as somebody who's lived, breathed, relied upon, and operated within the cyber domain over the last few years, the focus that was required, the rigor that was required, the cadre of people who get it, as we used to say 10 years ago, walking around the Pentagon. We were working on something jointly during the invasion of Iraq, and we'd go and see seniors, and there'd be that question mark: does he get it? Okay, and that was really important. And I think what we've been trying to do over the last sort of 10 years, and what we've been able to focus in on in the US through the stand-up of Cyber Command a couple of years, 3 years ago nearly now. In the UK, we're standing up the Joint Forces Cyber Group at the moment underneath Joint Forces Command. And it's that issue of getting people's head around why we focused in on cyber, the importance of it, and that recognition of it as a domain. It underpins everything we're doing now. Our reliance upon cyber and those layers of cyber, not just the sort of the physical, but the human layer and things like that, they sit in there. And the thing that I'm getting at here is this issue of the fact that if you even go back to, I don't know, Battle of Britain, everybody talks about the importance of Battle of Britain and radar. But actually, it was the information network which had been established in the decade beforehand. Originally, it wasn't fed by radar, it was fed by an acoustic ranging system. But it was an information network at the time which was mainly people and telephone lines. And obviously, since then, increasingly, the people have gone. The telephone lines have another form of data going across them, if you like, or another format going across them. And that reliance which is out there upon cyberspace for everything we do in the military is absolutely fundamental. And that was the argument we pushed through in the SDSR. But in terms of going back to this issue of working together jointly, to a degree, there have been a community of people who've got it. But as we said during the SDSR as well, we've got stovepipes of excellence out there. We've got a J6 community who's done some great stuff, who's got our networks reasonably well hardened. We've got some other folks who are thinking about, hey, what would we do with this when we're trying to do something to other people? We've got some other folks who are thinking hard about, hey, how do we go and hunt down bad guys? But all of those stovepipes have to interact if you've decided it's a domain. if you've decided it's a group of people who get it. You need all those disciplines in the room when you're planning your cyber operations, is what we found doing this for real. And, but I think going back to the point that Bill makes and has asked me about, we have done some of this stuff collaboratively reasonably well. As my learned colleague was referring to earlier on, you know, we do need those agreed definitions, the lexicon, etc., there. But what I suppose almost what I would say is a word of caution is that, you know, it's only about 30 years ago that somebody called Gibson came up with this term cyberspace, which everybody latched onto, and which he subsequently said didn't really have it written down as a defined thing. It was just something that came to me on the page in front of me. But it's grown to mean something, but it's evolving, and it's evolving rapidly. You know, I've been at Cyber Command now for just over a year. The difference between when I arrived back end of 2011 and where we are now in early 2013, and General Alexander's statement a couple of weeks ago, etc., is transformational. It really is, and it's a step change, biggest step change since the stand-up Cyber Command itself, the things that have started happening over the last few months. So it's evolving rapidly. Definitions are important to get our heads around it. We've done a lot of work on that, but I've been trying to work on a combined lexicon, or had the opportunity to try to input to a combined lexicon. And that's been going for over 10 years ago, since I first met Bill. But where we really need to be is in that area of, okay, 80% is probably good enough at the moment.
Right.
If you try to aim for 100%, you're going to have problems because it's evolving rapidly. And I can tell you from being up at the command, it's evolving rapidly. And back in the UK, since the SDSR a few years ago, it's evolving rapidly as well.
Thank you, Frosty. I'm going to pose the next question to Colonel French, who's been doing this for a while, disaggregation to a certain extent. We had a wonderful lunchtime message from General Hayton, who is a brilliant commander, a great guy. He understands that the biggest enemy of execution is complexity, and he wants to remove that from our lexicon. But if you were to break down the component parts of today's discussion and the discussion into the future, and apply cyberspace acquisition or operations across a network, it wouldn't just be the military network. It wouldn't be .mil. We'd have civilian cyberspace. How do you define it? Right now, to me, it seems more like www, and I'm not talking about the web. It's wild, wild west. Anything goes, anytime, anywhere. Once you push enter, you're in, and you're in for life, whether you like it or not. There may be a reasonable amount of security should be expected if you pay for it, but there are no rules. Commercial cyberspace, banking, shopping, commercial transactions, significant amount of security is expected, paid for by commercial entities, and personal computers must allow proof of inoculation via computer query before transactions are allowed. Military cyberspace boundaries. Post-it, warning, lethal forces authorized. We will SWAC you if you come here. The layer is very high level of military provided, uses a high level of military provided security, and it's enforced with a military grade response. You're going to get hit. How do we join these? Do we bring those together? How do we make all of them more vibrant by joining? Or should they all be disaggregated? And how do we move into the future?
Well, General Hayton's discussion today started to allude to many of the concepts that are progressing for disaggregation, the dependence and the separation, the dependence on different types of commercial systems, being disaggregated in that we are not trying to create a specific military connectivity between all of the multiple links and nodes that make up what we would call our cyberspace that we have to defend and operate through. Whereas in the same vein, we are working towards cloud computing. which starts to bring together the information that is most relevant. The descriptions that you alluded to did get down to the security level of, and were originally premised as we went through Schriever War Games, to try to identify which is the military target, which is the non-military target, which is the military target only after the Department of Homeland Defense asks for the military to get in there. And alluded to the reasonable expectation for the level of security that either you provide or the military provide, and then the retribution that would be part of that. Let me go further as we discuss a little bit about disaggregation from an acquisition side. I remember not too long ago, still in the computer age, in which we had disaggregation. In which I had a Palm Pilot, I had a cell phone, I had a notebook, I had a separate calendar book, and now I have that all in one device. Unfortunately, I have one device for my home, I have one device for the military, and then I have another pad device which will allow me to begin to actually write something down rather than on these little individual small devices. So disaggregation within cyber goes and comes back. But cyber was developed from a disaggregated perspective in that there are pieces, parts, components, subcomponents. Any one of those need both defending and as a target might be provide the effect that you want to, whether it be deny, degrade, disrupt, or manipulate. So from a disaggregated portion, I think cyber expands, comes together, but it depends on actually which component within the cyber space that starts to drive. But from this concept recently came as space, trying to determine whether or not it is better to aggregate all of the capability on a satellite that is now in space, that you have no longer much ability to destroy, to utilize if one component goes out. I have a TV at home in which the sound started going, but unfortunately it was also the DVD player, it was also the VCR player, and it was the television in our bedroom. So a component of disaggregation that if one, of aggregation, that if one component does not work, the whole system may not work. So from a disaggregated perspective, it's a way not to put all eggs in one basket.
Thank you, Colonel French. Dr. Kuciapinski, I'm going to pile up on you down there, so I don't think you're getting away. I'm going to allow you to comment on that aspect, but also Colonel French brings up a great point, and we see the proliferation of wireless sensors everywhere. You have exponential increases in usage across the spectrum, including resource management, traffic flow, security, business operations, RF emissions, RF broadcasts from devices have the potential, well, they actually do provide an integrated view of an environment. We can find, fix, and finish people. Let's just be honest. How could this be better integrated for society? At what point could this highly integrated view interfere with personal privacy? Are we there yet? Have we been there? And give us some applications. I know you delve in this area, but feel free to respond to earlier comments too, Kevin.
Well, beginning with the earlier comments, part of the unique organization that we're in, we deal with policy on a regular basis. We also deal with many international partners. And the reason we deal with policy on a regular basis is we operate generally within both Title 10 and Title 50, which creates some interesting complexities. A lot of these definitions that folks are really struggling with cyber, I think I've been coming to cyber conferences now for 4 or 5 years, and we're still having panels discussing how we're going to define it. A lot of that is because The technology is the same. It's the application that changes. And people who want to share sources and methods or want to defend sources and methods, depends how far into the other mission area you're willing to push that. So strategic intelligence, computer network techniques, or exploitation techniques, those would probably be the same techniques that would be advantageous to a military organization that is looking from a tactical perspective of how am I going to engage this enemy on this scale. So it really comes down to a legal definition. So we actually work quite closely with the NSA Office of General Counsel as we're developing technology. We work in a laboratory environment. So from our perspective, as we're watching technology and helping to develop new techniques, we see it as the technology right now is completely outpacing the policy process. By the time a policy document comes down to us and we're actually asked to give feedback to it, we're so far ahead of that at this point right now, we see a lot of policy documents that are being coordinated both internationally and between our own organizations, where they're looking at networks and cyber warfare as if it's a static environment still. Static networks, firewalls, we're going to keep people out. In the R&D world, we're not even looking at the landscape that way anymore. We see the cyber environment as probably the most vast definition of maneuver warfare that we've ever seen. And whoever can outmaneuver fast is going to win, whether you're, and that technique applies whether you're defending, whether you're offense, whether you're a bank, civil application, or even Facebook. So looking at it from that maneuver perspective, we really need to look at the environment as a whole, where everything out there we look at as a node or an access into the network. So that causes complications between the definition of what's a weapon system versus what's an IT system. If you're on the cutting edge of technology, anywhere that I can get in and get a foothold is good enough. And I don't really care what that is, whether it's a secretary's computer or an input to a sensor on an F-22. So looking at it from that everything out there is a node and a point to access, and looking at it from a maneuver perspective, talking to the policy folks, we ask them, well, what is it that we can provide you that's going to help you? Obviously, step one is we need the definitions, both within our own organizations and internationally. And they said, well, in order to understand how we're going to define these things, we really need more situational awareness. So we started looking at that right away. One of the first things we started looking at for situational awareness is right now it's very hard to attribute attack from any particular criminal organization or country. So we started looking at that problem, that we need to understand what's happening in order to know whose lane it's going to fall in and how it's going to be reacted to. So a lot of what we started looking at that is switching from the MAC layer into the physical layer. There's a lot of information to be gained from the physical layer environment. A lot of folks think that now moving into the RF realm, a lot of folks, you don't hear much about RF anymore. They think it with computer networks and computer network exploitation and cyber warfare, it's kind of fallen to the wayside. That is probably the furthest thing from the truth that you can possibly imagine. If you think about the landscape several decades ago, basically our last mile comms was completely wired, and our backhaul comms was all microwave and wireless. That has, basically the problem has completely inverted. Now our backhaul comms is all fiber optic and wired, and our last mile comms is all wireless. So that is the first place that we started looking when we want to get basic situational awareness of what's going on. So looking at new technologies such as radio frequency distinct native attribute fingerprinting, RFDNA fingerprinting, we're able to specifically look at the waveform that's being produced by a device and use that as a security advantage. So if somebody, now we're not saying that physical layer security can replace bit level security, but it can certainly augment it. So if a device tries to get on your network or contact a UAV or log on to a satellite and it doesn't match the waveform of the receivers that are within your network that you want that device to talk to, you can automatically reject it. But what that also gives you, besides a security advantage, is it gives you situational awareness. You know that somebody just tried to access your device that wasn't authorized. So you know you've been attacked, where sometimes on a bit level you may not. Some new technologies that are coming down, in addition, when we start looking currently, in the wireless realm, the only security option we have is encryption, and that's just basically a race right now. Algorithms are based on the computational complexity, and if your algorithm is faster at cracking the computational complexity of the system you're going after, then you'll win. If not, you won't. But we don't necessarily know somebody's trying. Now, looking at some new technologies, such as quantum key distribution, the fundamentals of quantum mechanics tell us that even to observe a quantum state, you're going to alter that state. So when we start moving into that level of encryption, we're automatically going to know that somebody is trying to observe. So that's going to provide you the situational awareness to know that somebody is trying to access that link. So we look at this from all perspectives, not just military. It's very hard to unravel these technologies nowadays. So if you think from a military application, if you're flying a UAV on a long-range mission, even if it's supporting another ally's operation, it's very difficult to unravel the air, the space, the cyberspace, and even the SIGINT aspects of that mission. If you figure you're flying a UAV, it's operating via a satellite link, somebody's trying to intercept your payload data, all that is playing at one point in time. So how then that creates a lot of difficulty for the lawyers of how are you going to separate these mission areas out. Now, if we move that outside into more of a commercial application, whether it's civil infrastructure, a lot of civil infrastructure now is moving towards wireless networks. I just read an article a couple months ago about the London ambulance service is now running half on RF and half on Wi-Fi, based on whatever's faster and whatever's easier. Whether we have SCADA systems for our critical infrastructure, we have tagging and tracking RF devices for trucking fleets, maritime vessels, shipping containers. There are a lot of access points that are spreading now. And we don't necessarily have to worry about just our military application. If someone can interrupt a supply chain or mess up your bank account back home or disrupt your family, they're definitely going to have an impact on the warfighter and what that person's able to do. So when we look at this, we try to look at the entire realm, and like I said, everything's a node, and whatever access point will work is what we expect the enemy to go after.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm going to challenge Colonel Dronia. It's 2018, you've taken off your military uniform, and now you're the head of all cyber for the United Nations. You've just written an international code of conduct for cyber. It's been signed by all the member nations, or a sufficient number to make it law. It was modeled basically after the maritime law, which disregarded national affiliations, requires all ship captains to come to the aid of other vessels in response to distress, pirates, and bring aid or relief. How would you describe what would this look like? And is code of conduct an accurate description of where this might go?
Well, it's a tricky question. First of all, I would say, hey, code of conduct, must it be signed? This is a key question from my perspective. So therefore, especially for the cyberspace, I don't see really that we will have a kind of law, treaty, or whatever signed by all nations in the UN in there. But at least I think there is a common understanding which may lead into a kind of maybe written or even unwritten code of conduct, how to behave and how to use the cyberspace. The problematic by that is, from my perspective, the cyberspace for the first moment really opens the door that the players who are using this environment are not any longer the governmental organization and the non-governmental organization. It is more or less everybody who puts the enter button of a computer. And this is the difference in there. So therefore, how to convince at the present 7 billion individuals to sign this The only way is to come up in a kind of code of conduct which will be evolved over the time as well. Though it's not a static in there, there's a kind of continuous growing, evolving there, like the cyberspace itself. And this is the reason why I'm not aiming at, and if you've listened to my introduction there, I was never calling for definitions on what is a cyber attack, what is a cyber incident. I was only talking about we should achieve a certain degree of common understanding on these issues.
If I might,
Please,
cyber is usually worked what we euphemistically call the coalition of the willing, right. Which kind of gets to the same question. And actually, in order to get 7 billion individuals all to use it in an ethical manner, it's almost an ethical use of cyber as an internet communications.
Good point. Thank you. I have a few questions. Frosty, I'm coming to you. Some domains lend themselves to specific inherent asymmetric advantages. For instance, the aerospace domain favors advanced, developed industrial actors. What are some of the inherent advantages and disadvantages of the cyber domain? It's
another tricky question, but that's why we're up here as panelists. The disadvantages start from how rapidly it's evolved as a domain. The previous question posed around the maritime domain and the laws which govern operations at sea have evolved over thousands of years. Okay, they originated in the ancient Greek world. Then Richard the Lionheart's mother put in place the Admiralty Law. And I won't mention something that was used for, but some people in this room know how that was used effectively in law a couple hundred years ago. But my point being there is that evolution of law that governs the way in which the maritime domain is used. And don't forget, this isn't just about the enforcement, but it's also about the fact that some people use the maritime environment under some agreements, some laws, some common understandings, and then there are people who use it recreationally, who are just out there with some very basic rules of the road that they use to do that. So, you know, I'm not saying that you can treat cyberspace in the same way that you can treat the maritime domain. It's different. That's why I think wisely we've decided that we will put a boundary around it. I'm not going to get into any more of the technical details because my learned colleague on the right clearly gets it, and he's laid out quite a lot of what the issues are. But I think in terms of the advantages and disadvantages of cyberspace, what comes to my mind is the spectrum which my colleague mentioned. Anything from the far left-hand side, the high-end use of cyberspace, military use, to the far right-hand end, you know, that day-to-day domestic use which we're all talking about. And therein lies the issues around the advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantages in the fact that, you know, we worry about the fact that anybody and everybody is part of this domain, but at the same time, that if AT&T want to, they can go dial down into your personal device and look at you if you're on their network. Okay, so it's, you know, it's like anything. It's a question of getting your head around the issues, the technologies, the various elements within the domain. But once you start thinking about that and applying some of the technology, which has advanced very rapidly, we're talking about it from the military perspective, but outside of the military domain, there's some technology which, from a military perspective, we can gain advantage by harnessing what's happened out there. So I think what I'm saying is some of those disadvantages, which meant that big networks needed to be able to manage down to the individual layer, okay, or the individual, can be turned on its head and used to your advantage should you need to. And we're talking about military. We're talking about the application of lethal force, should it be required, to maintain what is agreed norms of operation. You know, the military, we're not into militarizing cyberspace. The military is interested in making sure that we can do our role when we're called upon to, if you like, use that lethal force if it's required, if we're talking about defend the nation, Clearly, though, we recognise that if other, there are advantages that we can utilise cyberspace for in terms of gaining military advantage in a broader sense, and also we're also interested, of course, in making sure that from a military perspective, the DoD information networks, as we're now referring to them as, that we're making sure we're out there hunting for people out there. Inherent advantages, I think, from a military perspective, is it's a global domain. I touch it here, I can touch it everywhere, sort of. Okay, it is bounded by some geography, but it does give me a global domain, the likes of which we'd never really had to operate in before, i.e. with reference to the fact that it's speed of light. So that's a massive advantage to us. Going back to some of those disadvantages, of course, is that, it's not like the Cold War. It's not like our adversary might be using a different protocol. Pretty much everybody's using the same protocol. Okay, and as we were talking about with the maneuverism earlier on, it's so fast moving because everybody's operating in the same space with the same technology and the same understanding, that trying to keep pace from a government type perspective, and the military being part of your government, and keeping up with what's happening outside is a challenge which we've never faced before. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I'm going to throw out some more questions from the audience, and maybe we'll try to shorten our answers. I know it's a difficult discussion and professional. In that, when we discuss maneuver, Kevin, I really like that because it's hard to find and fix because it's moving so rapidly. So is there a role for international cooperation to have better situational awareness in the cyber domain?
Absolutely. I would think especially during an attack, regardless of who the attack is against. We think of maneuver warfare. Specifically, I think of a dynamically adjusting network. We're doing a lot of research into cloud computing technologies right now in the laboratory. And one of the advantages, what we're looking for with that, and we're developing it with our allies, is that by having these nodes, that basically we can absorb an attack and would be able to reconfigure our network quickly. We look at it from the perspective of, there was a great presentation at Black Hat 2012 by a gentleman from Mandian, and he basically said we need to look at the environment now that we can't prevent an attack no longer. So what we need to do is figure out how to mitigate it and adjust as quickly as possible. Cloud computing technology would allow us to do that, because if one node was attacked, we could immediately switch those functions to another node and then continue working forward. However, when we start changing networks like that quickly, we need to work very closely with our allies, as we very rarely do anything alone nowadays. Everybody needs to understand what's changing, what's happening as quickly as possible. Now, that maneuver warfare perspective can be also taken to the physical realm with new technologies such as software-defined radio. Imagine if a satellite or an aircraft was being on a hacking attempt was being made. If you can use that software-defined radio to immediately change your waveform in the way you're communicating, you've just stopped that attack. They're going to have to figure out, back up to stage one. What type of waveform are you using? How are we going to get in? So that's what we're probably going to see happening in the future. And it's going to be moving that fast, and we're going to have to be coordinating with our allies if we expect to continue to work together to use one nation's ISR assets to use another nation's weapon system to put a bomb on target.
Colonel French?
If I might,
Please.
One of the advantages of sharing that information is each individual nation has response options that are potentially different than any single nation. And so responding to any type of either a defensive measure or offensive measure allows that freedom.
Colonel Dronia, what is your top priority for collaboration and cooperation in the domain with allied coalition partners?
I think the most important stuff is really to exchange the information about what I'm planning to do and what I'm going to do in order not to run into a situation like I described in my example. On the other hand, to leave somebody unaware about what is my intention in there. Otherwise, coalitions or let's say partners working together can't really work efficiently with each other.
Another question, and anyone can grab this one, and believe it or not, I'm somewhat familiar with this. Beyond physical technologies, where are we in the planning process for implementing quote-unquote big data constructs to help aid the fight? ETL systems can't keep up with volumes of information produced, and should we have to only look at structured data? I can honestly say there are analytic systems out there that don't need an ETL layer and don't need to have structured data. Kevin?
Well, it's an interesting question because we're actually dealing with this with a project we have in the laboratory right now. As this cloud computing technology is developing and we're starting to put data from multiple sources all in one location at one time, nobody's really sure exactly what extra knowledge we can gain from that. We all suspect that there's some extra knowledge there, but nobody knows how to merge it. Now, what we run into there are actually more system and bureaucratic roadblocks than we do technological roadblocks. As we heard in the General's lunchtime presentation, it's very hard to get anything done when you don't have a program of record. Well, I actually had somebody quote us when we were trying to put together a program to let some smart engineers get in there, work with the data, see what kind of new knowledge they could gain. One of the responses back was, well, there's no official program. It's nobody's job to go play with the data. Well, sometimes we have to take that leap and put that research and experimentation forward to see what happens. Now, in this constrained environment, perhaps paying a full-time staff engineer is not the best way to go about doing that. But we have military schools, service academies. We could throw some interns at it. Sometimes you get the absolute greatest leaps forward by giving a fresh new student and a fresh set of eyes a high-powered computer and a big stack of data. You'd be amazed what they can do with it. So working the problem in our traditional acquisition process may not necessarily be the best way to look at some of these new technologies. Sometimes it's better to let a student work at it, experiment, see what we can come up with, and then build a program from there instead of trying to come up with what we think they might be able to do and then work a program down from that.
Thanks, Kevin. Quite frankly, I'd like us all to go to the bar or wherever and continue this conversation. This is fascinating for me. I want to thank you for taking the time to fly out and engage us. Colonel Dronia, thank you for coming across the pond. Colonel French, getting away from your busy desk and your stack of emails. This has been very rewarding, and I hope the audience appreciate it, and maybe we can show how much we appreciate it.